Well, hello, viewers of the Erudite Bibliophile with Wanderlust. I am so lucky today to bring you the best selling, award winning author, Karen Joy Fowler. Welcome, Karen. Thank you for being here. She was recently nominated for the long list of the Booker Prize, which she has been nominated with before for the short list. And so, if you've read her recent historical fiction release, Booth, there's no question as to why she was nominated. It's such a richly layered, thought provoking novel. So we just thank you
Thank
so
you
much
so
for being
much.
with us.
Thank you.
Well, and being from Indiana and going to IU myself, I wanted to first start out with, for our local Hoosier viewers, mentioning the connection you have to Indiana with being born in Bloomington and spending your first 11 years here before moving to California. And I know that you've mentioned before the influence of living out west, that how it has influence on American authors. So I didn't know if those early years in the Midwest, if that had any influence on your work ever. I know you kind of talked about before your mom saying you wrote short stories when you were 5 and that you were quite a voracious young reader. So I didn't know if there any impact on these early years in the Midwest, if you felt that in your work at all.
I think except except for the stories that actually do take place in Bloomington, of which I have quite a few. I I would be hard pressed to say exactly where it appears, but my connection to Bloomington and to the early years of my childhood is so profound and so powerful that I would think that that even if I can't point to something and say there it is, that it's probably there throughout. One of the strongest memories I have of moving to California was my sort of shock that the yards were all fenced.
Yeah.
In Bloomington, I could go out into my backyard and I could traverse everybody else's backyard on the block as well. So it seemed like that I had a lot of space and freedom when I was in Indiana, and my life in California was much more circumscribed. And so, a lot of what I think about when I think about Bloomington is just that sense of time and space and freedom. Um, and some of that is related to Bloomington, and some of that is just related to the 1950s when I was there, because certainly my children have less of that, and my grandchildren have even less than their parents had. They all live in kind of urban places, and I think they're having very happy childhoods, but
Right.
it makes me sad.
Right. And do you still have family back here in Indiana?
I don't. For many, many, many years, our next door neighbors, who were essentially second parents to me growing up, were still not only in Bloomington, but in the house they had always been in, next door to the house that I had grown up. But their children, who were my closest friends, have all moved away, uh, and uh, and the two parents have died now. So that was sort of my last really powerful link in terms of people.
Well, and when we talk about Booth, the historical fiction release, for some readers, this may be their first foray into your work. And so they might be surprised to know about all the previous literary and personal work you've done in the science fiction genre. However, you've talked about the beginnings of Booth actually originating in 3 short stories. One being about Edwin's return to the stage after the assassination, which was John Wilkes Booth's brother, and then one about Junius Booth having a funeral for pigeons, which was his father. But the most importantly, the very first story was called Standing Room Only, which was about a time travel story about tourists traveling back in time to the assassination of President Lincoln to that day. And so I didn't know you've been very open about the numerous challenges and various benefits of writing specifically in each genre. So I didn't know if your next work, if you would continue in one of those two genres or completely go in a different direction? Or now that you've kind of traversed both genres, what might be your next work in?
Well, I'm unsettled as to what I'm going to do next, but the thing that I'm thinking about most at the moment would probably actually fall into the fantasy category. But I'm also thinking of it, I'm thinking of a middle grade book, which I've also never done before. But primarily, I'm thinking of it as a thank you letter to all of the librarians in my life and my country. I feel, with the astonishing level of book bannings going on, that librarians are once again on the front lines for the First Amendment, at where they so often find themselves. And so I'm hoping the book will be just a little buck me up from someone who has lifelong reasons to be grateful to the people who run the libraries.
And kind of probably originated some of that voracious reading when you were younger. You probably have lots of library memories from Bloomington when you were.
When we were in Bloomington, my family, all four of us, my mother, my father, my brother, and I went to the library every Friday.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And my mother got me a big basket because I couldn't carry all the books I wanted home.
And that was your library basket
that was my library basket, yes.
That's awesome. Well, and when you read, like when we talk about reading as a child, but reading now, when you read for yourself, do you read in your current writing genres? Do you like to read outside your genres, or what do you like to read genre wise?
I'd like it all. I'm a book might find its way into my hands in any number of ways, but usually because a friend has recommended it, and I do a lot of reading. I think you might be surprised how much of my reading is books that have not yet been published, that people want, maybe a blurb, maybe the book has sold, and they're hoping to put my name on the back cover, or maybe the book has not sold yet and they're hoping that some enthusiasm from me will make an editor more interested. But I've taught for a number of years, and in a number of places, and I have a lot of friends who are writers. So I would say more than half of my reading is books that are not yet on the shelf.
That's wonderful. Well, and then what about one of those research periods, like when you're, you know, head deep in like all the research books for what you're currently writing? How do you balance like your personal reading time with all of that other research time? Because I know, like, when I was in college and we had so much reading to do and things like that, my personal reading time kind of took a back seat for a long period until then you're out of it and then you're back able to read all that. So how do you balance when you're getting all these personal books but you're stack high? I know you researched Booth, where it was an 8 to 10 year process. So how do you balance that? Does that lessen when you're in one of those big research periods?
It's tricky. There are periods where I just have to call a halt um, to the blurb kind of reading I was talking about, that I just don't have the time for it. But in general, um, I I do the research in the hours I think of as my work time, which is sort of between 9 and 3, and in the evenings or the late afternoons when I'm really too tired to do anything but be dazzled by somebody else's book, then I do my pleasure reading.
Does it ever like influence what you're currently writing? Like you're in the middle of a book and see how that author did a certain scene or a point
Oh,
of view or what, and then you're like, wait, make me think about what I'm writing. Like,
absolutely, all the time. I don't imagine that I would be able to write a book if I weren't simultaneously reading. That I get ideas from other people's work all the time, and and not in the straightforward kind of research way, but just something in a book that's as far afield as you can imagine from what I'm trying to do will just spark something in my brain, and um, I'll think uh, it will lead to something in some sort of very incoherent way, but there it is.
And it's almost research too.
Yes.
Well, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the Booker Prize for fiction that you were nominated for, because there might be some viewers who might not be as familiar with it. So I want to talk a little bit about the background of that. It is, quote, like they say it's the leading literary award for the English speaking world. So ta-da for you on that. And some of the statistics about it were about 34% of the winners have been female, including the famed female author Margaret Atwood. Some of our most
And let me just take a moment to acknowledge the passing of Hilary Mantel. I was very surprised and shocked and saddened to see that yesterday.
I immediately thought of you when I saw that too, because I know how much you admired her work and have talked about her quite a bit during this Booker Prize kind of tour. And I think they said she was the first female and British author to have won the Booker Prize twice.
I think that's true.
Yeah. So, I mean, kudos. And also, I think a lot of the famous books turned into film that people might recognize that were Booker Prize nominated, besides Margaret Atwood's work and Hilary Mantel, was Schindler's Ark, Life of Pi, The English Patient. So it has a very, storied past winner list. And it's known for bringing recognition to authors' work, it kind of expanding their reach and their readership globally, bringing monetary awards for the winner and the shortlist nominees, as well as being known for this Booker bounce, as far as an increase in sales for the readers and things like that. So I didn't know, now that you've been nominated twice, if you could speak a little bit about what it means to be nominated for the Booker Prize for the long list this year, especially for a work where you were kind of doing a different style, where the work spanned over decades of a timeline and where you had prominent historical figures as the main characters, something kind of different than what you normally did, to be nominated for that work. And then just in general, like what the effects of awards like this and like the Penn Faulkner Award that you've also won in the past, the effect on your career, your life, kind of what it means when you're nominated for all these awards and winning and things.
But I think it's hard to know what exactly the impact is, except that they certainly create a rise in your visibility and are obviously very, very heartening as a writer to get. I'm well aware of how fortunate I've been to have had the attention that I've had. The first time when I was on the short list was I think career changing. I think so many people who had not heard of me before were suddenly aware of me, and the book We're All Completely Beside Ourselves, much of which takes place in Bloomington, did very, very well in terms of sales and review attention. And one of the things I think about a lot with reference to that is that the year that I was nominated was the first year that Americans were eligible. But the Booker Award prior to that, was Canada, was books in English, but not books by Americans. And expanding the pool to include Americans was very controversial. But also that We're All Completely Beside Ourselves was published in the US a couple of years earlier. And the reason there was a lag time is that it went to several presses in Britain who did not wish to publish it. It kept getting rejected for a British publication. and that was, that was very disappointing, and not at all what I had hoped for. But the reason I think about it now is that in many ways, I feel things that initially seemed like disappointments to me in my career have turned out to be very, very lucky. If the book had been accepted by one of these earlier publishers, it would have been published the year before, and the year before Americans weren't eligible.
That's
Uh,
not serendipitous.
so, just could all of those rejections were the best thing that could possibly have happened to the book. Um, I did not make the short list this year. I was on the long list, which was thrilling and wonderful, and I was not on the short list, which was disappointing and crushing. And I, I don't know if the long list has the impact. I mean, I'm sure it doesn't have the impact that the short list does. I don't know what kind of impact the long list might have, but I'm hopeful.
Well, and do you feel sometimes that with publisher and reader expectations, that sometimes authors or yourself, do you ever feel like you're pigeonholed into kind of like one genre? Like, and it's made such a big deal when writers switch into different genres, which, like I said, you've done multiple genres and might be going into other genres. Do you ever feel like you kind of get pigeonholed by publisher or reader expectations into a certain genre?
The only time I've ever felt that is after the success of the Jane Austen book club. I think there were a lot of people who had not read my other novels, but read that one. And then when they picked up my next book or an earlier book, what they really wanted was that wanted, they wanted a book exactly like that. And so there was a lot of disappointment that my other books did not look like that one. But that was that was kind of a temporary phase. And I think that anybody who's had that experience with my work now understands that I'm going to be trying to do something different with every book.
Right, challenging you too.
Well, I'm easily bored. So, if I think I know how to write a book, I'm not really interested in writing it. I like the challenge. I like the struggle. I like the problem solving is part of what I really like about being a writer. So if the problem comes pre-solved, uh, I just have no energy for it.
And then if you do go into a different genre, like let's say you do the middle grade novel, do you then, besides reading in that genre a lot, like you were mentioning before, do you go to authors that write in that genre and kind of talk shop of that genre, or do you just kind of problem solve on your own and read on your own and go from there, or?
Yeah, mostly. I mean, I'm in a writing workshop, so I have other writers looking at everything that I do, but they're not particularly specialists in any area. They write all over the map. Um, so mostly I would work by reading, and as luck would have it, I have grandchildren. I read aloud to them, so I'm reading a lot of middle grade stuff anyway.
Yeah. And that did that kind of too also inspire going into that genre, because now you have grandchildren and that are reading that genre.
Yes, definitely.
Well, and I want to talk back, going back to Booth. I thought the title was everything, because in that one word, that one name, for so many of us, we hear that and we think of John Wilkes Booth and we think of his assassination of Lincoln, um, and because of that one event. But if that event hadn't happened and history had taken a different path, it could very easily, we could probably be thinking of Edwin Booth, his brother, or Junius Booth, his father, who were arguably the more famous Booths than John because of their Shakespearean acting prowess. And, they ran in these very high profile elite circles. But because of that one event, that marked forever a scourge on like the whole large Booth family, because of that assassination. And almost, divided their lives into this pre-assassination period and post-assassination period. And shockingly enough, I mean, their views were so different from John. Their views on Lincoln, slavery, the Civil War, the grandfather was possibly part of the Underground Railroad. I mean, they were completely different than John, yet they had now this stigma and stain that would always stay with them because of this horrific crime he committed. And so I didn't know if you were able to speak more on kind of what their lives were like going forward after the assassination. Were they able to escape that stain and stigma, or are those answers coming in a future book from you, or because
No, I'm done with the Booths.
you're like, I'm over the Booths.
One of the things that I found ironic is that at least the younger children in the Booth family, I felt had a very peculiar attachment to the family name, a real need to have their father's genius recognized, to bring luster to the Booth name in a way that seemed peculiar to me. I certainly did not spend a lot of my childhood thinking, well, I just hope I can make the name of Burke
Yeah.
mean more. So they all were very conscious of bearing their father's name, of their father's various scandals, of trying to rescue the family name to focus on their father's genius rather than on his peculiarities, so that they could, the respect they thought the name should have, they were all very invested in making sure that it did have. And I think that even part of John's thinking in the assassination was that this would bring some sort of valor to the name of Booth, which of course it did not. But so yes, in choosing the title, the difficulty I saw was exactly what you said, that people would pick it up thinking this is going to be a book about John Wilkes Booth. But because all of the children seemed so invested in the family name, and the book is about the family of Booth, it seemed appropriate. It seemed like the appropriate title. Their lives after the assassination obviously did change dramatically. Edwin did manage to come back. He recovered his career. He had a lot of difficulties in his later life, but they mostly involved his second wife, who was just a very unhappy, publicly, loudly unhappy marriage in which he was accused of all kinds of abuse by her and by her family. So, his struggles continued, but they weren't so related to the assassination. Asia, the younger sister and probably the sibling who loved John the most, I think her life was completely destroyed. That she too had struggles that weren't related to the assassination. She had some children who died, but as a result of the assassination, she and her husband relocated to England. As a result of the assassination, her husband, who had wished to divorce her after the assassination, but she had refused to do that. He ceased to behave like a husband in any way. He was quite free, fancy free, and quite cruel to her. And ironically, in terms of where I started with their investment in the family name. I think part of the reason he married her was because she was a Booth, and this was such an illustrious theatrical name, and he also was an actor. And then the reason he wanted to divorce her was that he was now, uh, humiliated to be part of the Booth family. Having said that, he really does seem to be quite a piece of work because for all of his protestations that he wasn't a Booth, that he didn't wish to be a Booth, that it was an awful family, that he was the one who restaged Our American Cousin after the assassination. So he was clearly hoping to, to profit on the infamy of that event.
And then anything about Joe or the other siblings?
Joe is in many ways, I think, the most peculiar of the Booths, and there is less information about him. He spent so much of the time out of the family, even as a child, for some reason that I was never able to completely determine. Even when they could hardly feed themselves, he was off at boarding school. The rest of the family was there, and he was not. He was always being sent away, and then he took himself off. When he was older, he went and worked for a while in Australia. Showed up eventually in San Francisco, where the oldest brother was, and worked there for a while. When he came back to the East Coast, his mother and oldest sister came to live with him. And again, he had difficulties, but they don't seem so much to be associated with the assassination as they are with just that he was a very difficult person and his neighbors despised him and threw rocks at his house. But uh, he's the one that still intrigues me, I have to say, maybe because I don't know so much about him. I would love to know what he was doing during those years in Australia. I would love to have that story. And I think, if I had to sum him up in a brief couple of sentences, I would say that after uh, Fort Sumter was fired on, he was in medical school and he enlisted as a doctor in the Confederacy, but he was quickly bored with it, very, very quickly, and he deserted, and he went back to the Baltimore area where they were living. And then he enlisted in the Union Army, and apparently under the belief that he would be officer material, that he would very quickly be in charge of troops. And when it was clear that that wasn't going to happen, he deserted that army as well. And so I think I can't imagine there are many people who, within the space of 1 year, deserted from both the
And
Confederate
fought for both
and the
sides
Union Army.
without seemingly consequences.
Yes, no consequences.
It's like they had they almost too, yes, they were scourged by the incident in the name, but they almost created their own problems and infamy too. It sounds like after the fact. It wasn't all based on that. They did their own.
Well, they were already leading very problematic lives, all of them.
Yeah. Well, and did you feel like a sense of responsibility or desire to kind of show how these six siblings that had made it to adulthood out of the 10, how they all, had faced the same family incidences and two, the national events that were occurring around them. They all kind of, you know, suffered losing multiple siblings. They all went through the Civil War, the draft riots. They went through their father's manic episodes, the revelation of his bigamy, the humiliation of his first wife and child. I mean, they all kind of went through all these big national and personal family things. Yet, John's the only one who, veered off into this big, like, extremist beliefs and kind of bitter hate. They all kind of were under that same influences, but none of the others responded in that way as far as where he went with the Confederacy and all of those things. So did you feel like a responsibility desire to kind of show, kind of how they differed versus, where he went to show that kind of diet, the opposite of that?
Yes, I think, that's one of the things in the story that interests me. I think, it's if you sort of picture to yourself the kind of person who's going to become an assassin, I don't think you pictured someone like John Wilkes, who was, popular and successful, witty and charming, just had a lot that he was good at, and had a family who loved him very much, despite the different political opinions that they had. So it's one of the peculiarities, I think, is that in many ways, Edwin had so much harder a childhood. That his childhood, in fact, was cut very short by the necessity that he travel with his father, and all of the time that he spent on the road with this very difficult, demanding, and often quite cruel person. And while John was at home being, beloved by his mother, for whom he was clearly always the favorite, and his sisters who adored him, and yet John is the one who grew up so angry, and Edwin not so much. So it is interesting. It's also, it's something that in our current situation we are very familiar with, I think. The family member who goes off the deep end into some sort of political conspiracy theory, and how the rest of the family attempts to deal with that is not an issue I have myself, which I feel quite fortunate about, but I'm watching that happen in families that I know and with people that I know. And it's just it's very, very hard.
And then when you were doing the research into him and his family, how much did you know prior to all of this? How much did you know about John Wilkes Booth and his family prior to doing the research? And when you were researching, what shocked and surprised you the most when you were like diving into that rabbit hole of the Booth family?
When I started, I think I knew no more than every American knows. I knew that John Wilkes Booth had murdered Abraham Lincoln. I knew that it happened in a theater. I knew that John Wilkes Booth had been an actor. Um, I maybe knew that there had been a manhunt afterwards, that he hadn't been caught immediately, uh, but not a lot more than that, and nothing really about his family. So all of it was a surprise to me. I think, the most shocking initial thing is something you've already alluded to, which is that his family's politics were just so very different than his. That his father was, a vegetarian, and very sensitive to cruelty, uh, um, uh, uh, towards people or animals. His father, is a fascinating character because he is such a mix. On the one hand, he could be quite cruel and violent himself, and on the other hand, he could also be incredibly charming and gentle. And on the farm where they lived year round, and he lived when he wasn't touring, no animal was allowed to be hurt. And in fact, he did not want flowers picked because uh, they were blameless. Why cut their beautiful lives short in that way?
And two, with Junius, like you said, it's like John Wilkes Booth kind of, like you said, took that name that they were so proud of alluding to this gentleman. You know, it's the fact that you hear Booth and you think that. I mean, I didn't know too, talking about that title again, when you went to the UK and or did UK international events, whether it be virtually or in person or press, you know, how is it different, you know, for, you know, because for many Americans, you know, we hear Booth and we immediately associate it with John Wilkes Booth and the assassination. But for many of those readers, they may not know who John Wilkes Booth is, and there may not be that same, you know, name recognition that came with Booth for an American seeing that title. So it, you know, what pulled them into the book and what were their kind of resulting impressions, because they don't have the same, you know, biases and decreased objectivity that we have as Americans when we see something like Booth. You know.
Almost all of the people who've come to my book events, which are the only ones, you know, that I've actually spoken to, did recognize the name of John Wilkes Booth. They did, you know, they started off pretty much where I started off. They knew that he had killed Abraham Lincoln, and that was about it. But they did know that. I think that at least among the people who have bought the book or are interested in the book or are coming to see me, very few of them did not recognize the name. I think I would be curious how many Americans would recognize the name Guy Fawkes, and what, if anything, they would attach to that name, because I would think it might be something similar. But I think that uh, that even though it is not their Civil War, that the people in Britain are interested in our Civil War, and particularly in the extent to which it continues to color our politics.
And then for readers, did they, so it kind of sounds like they had the same kind of takeaways, or the same, they came in with the same amount of, you know, knowledge of previous, and then they had the same kind of takeaways. That, I mean, you didn't see a difference when, whether you were doing book
It didn't, but you know, as I am trying to suggest, and should just say outright, you know, this is a select group. They have come to see me, so they are already interested. In the population at large, I have no idea.
Right, right. Well, and I didn't know there were, you know, different periods through the book where you interspersed bits about Lincoln, you know, whether what was going on in his life at the time, how their lives intersected, Lincoln and the Booths, or even I felt like sometimes lesser known information that I learned about, that, you know, about a president where, you know, a lot is well known. You know, he's a very well known admired president, and so I was learning even new things. So how did you decide like what to include and put in about Lincoln? Was there anything that was left out about the intersection and connectivity of their past that we, I mean, we did read some in the book, but I didn't know if everything made it in, if there was other things too that you know, had found out when you researched?
Oh, well, obviously, you know, there are there's enough material to write books and books and books about Lincoln, and people have done so. So this is, you know, this is a very small slice of Lincoln's life, and just you know, I mostly was focused on the timeline, so that if I included a section for Lincoln, it was contemporaneous with what the Booths were doing. So, you know, here are the Booths in 1948, 1848. And, you know, at this same time, here's where Lincoln is, and here's what Lincoln is doing at that moment.
And then where's, besides them intersecting as far as like you sometimes see in plays and inviting John Wilkes Booth to the White House, which he obviously declined, were there any other periods of intersection between the two families?
There, I believe now, according to a book I just read by Terry Alford, I think that Lincoln's young son Tad spent some time at backstage at Ford's Theater and maybe knew John Wilkes a little when he was a child. I did not know that when I was writing the book, or I would have included it.
Wow. It's so crazy, all these intersections, and never knowing where that was going to lead.
Well, partly I think because the Booths, traveled so much from stage to stage and city to city. Their lives just seem to have intersected with every famous person you've ever heard of from that period. Louisa May Alcott went to see both Junius and Edwin perform and preferred Edwin's style of acting to Junius's, but Walt Whitman, the opposite, thought that, Edwin was a bloodless kind of performer as compared to his father, whom Walt Whitman admired enormously. So, Edgar Allan Poe wanders through, Sam Houston wanders through, Junius sends a threatening letter to Andrew Jackson, and they just seem to have known everybody.
Right. Yeah, and we knew so little about them, only about Booth until then. Well, and I was actually, when you talked about, I was reading a book recently too, where Edwin Booth was mentioned twice. One reference was in regards to his Gramercy Park, Players Club in New York. The other reference was that, speaking of people who saw him, was Nellie Bly had went and seen him, Edwin Booth, play Hamlet at the Broadway Theater in New York the night she found out that she was going to get to go race around the world. So it was kind of refreshing to see his name in print, but with no reference of like his connection to John, no reference of brother to John or anything related to John. So it was refreshing to see that, but then also to even know when I saw his name about him and about his background, which I don't know if I would have known or connected it to that degree if it hadn't been for your book, Booth. So I didn't know if, because of the popularity in Booth, if you think there might be like a resurgence and interest in like the Booth family, like say an Asia's book that's been, published in the 30s and was republished in the 90s, or an uptick in, visits to their Maryland family home, or to that Georgia Opera House where Edwin's ghost resides, or a new TV series or film about John Wilkes Booth or his family. Like, I didn't know, because like I said, I think it's bringing it all back to the forefront. There's always people who've been interested in that family, but now, like you said, more of a wider reach and general population who are now discovering the Booths.
I hope so. I have no idea who's reading my book and what they're taking from it, but that would be lovely if that happened. I would
Have you heard, has there been like an uptick in visits to their
No,
home, or you haven't heard anything?
I haven't heard anything.
Or even the fact that like Putnam was the one who originally published her book. I'm like, how full circle. It's like
I
so.
know. And not only did they publish the book, but the Booths lived in Putnam's house during the draft riots in New York City.
That's right. I forgot that part. I mean, how full circle. Well, yeah, it's just like you said, this whole serendipitous nature of all of those things. Um, and then have you gotten any um, like letters from any, or responses from kind of like the Booth fanatics that have followed this family like for all these years, regarding your book, or regarding their thoughts or different pieces of your research compared to what they've thought? Or
I made contact with a lot of the people who've done a lot of work prior to writing the book as part of my research project. So, so I was already in conversations with them. And so a couple of them have written to say that they like the book, but no, mostly what I've gotten are letters from people who didn't know much about the family and found them interesting.
and being like shocked at just all that rich history that's there. And so takeaways too, would you is there anyone that, now that you've done this kind of historical fiction where you followed these prominent figures, is there anybody in the future where you thought, now I kind of want to look into this person or go into this avenue now that you've had this foray into to diving deep into these prominent historical figures and going these epic decade timelines, doing something like that again? And who would you be interested in?
Well, like I said, I would love to know what Joe Booth was doing in Australia. If I could find that out, I might be able to
You
make a
might
book
actually
out of
visit
that.
the booth again.
But otherwise, there are a number of female actresses at the time whose lives are extremely interesting, and that I might think about. Laura Keene is somebody
Right.
that I'm still very intrigued by, and I'm now forgetting the name of the woman who played Lady Macbeth opposite Edwin, that he complained that she was so much bigger than him. But I did some, very cursory Wikipedia kind of research about her and thought, oh, this is an interesting person. So
Well, were they
the actress,
prominent in your research? Like, did you feel like the female actresses got as much? I mean, was there as much meat in the research that you could see about them, or was it kind of how sometimes history does, where they kind of leave out some of the prominent women and
no, these
they were
women were
equally there, but they get this much, and the guys get you know.
these women were pretty scandalous, so they got
Oh,
a
they got
fair
the
amount of
brunt.
print. That appears to be the secret in being remembered, is to be
It's creating
shocking.
scandal to be remembered.
Yeah,
So Laura Keene and then the lady who played Macbeth, because these were ones that you didn't know anything about until you'd done the research with the booths,
that's
correct?
right. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Well, I've just had a great time digging in further into the booths and your work with you and whatnot, and I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And we look forward to seeing what's coming up next for you, whether it be the middle grade novel or what's coming up next for Karen Joy Fowler.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I am as curious as you are, probably more so.
And two, thank you for bringing up Hillary Mantel too. Um, Important weekend regarding that, and we wish you all the luck going forward.
Thank you so much. It's been
Thank you
a
so much.
pleasure.
Thank you.